Hello, teleSUR English presents China Now, a production of Way Media that showcases the reality of the Asian giant. In this segment, China's current Kris Yang talks about the damages that typhoon Doksuri caused with the extreme weathers and torrential rains flooding several provinces across the country. Kris also goes on technological breakthroughs regarding the creation of drones and the emergence of Team China with an impressive haul of 4 medals at the final World Championship. In the session, Thinkers Forum Professor Yi Wen largely examines with Peter Walker the real differences between the US and China in the political sphere. After these previews, join us on this new episode of China Now.
China Current is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started. Hi, welcome to China Currents. I'm Kris. Last week, typhoon Doksuri swept across China. On July 28, it made landfall in Xinjiang, Fujian province with winds equivalent to a Category 2 hurricane and rainfall that exceeded 300 millimeters. By the time it left Fujian, the typhoon had caused a direct loss of 52 million yuan. Floods and landslides caused by the typhoon had affected more than 720,000 people. Among them, over 400,000 were relocated as their homes were badly damaged. Here's a clip of the floods in the city of Fuzhou. Streets turning to rivers. We can imagine how desperate adjacent residents and small business owners were. Wait, let's go back a little bit. Have you noticed a little semi-basement restaurant that was miraculously protected? The little restaurant is called 筷子豪情, literally means chopsticks passion. Thanks to the video, the restaurant went viral on social media. The owner was hailed as a 抗洪模范, a model in resisting floods. Fujian was not the only province suffered from typhoon. The biggest victims are surprisingly the northern provinces, which should have been in drought during summer. At 6 a.m. July 31st, the Central Meteorological Observatory issued a rainstorm red alert as the typhoon Doksuri moved northwards, resulting in widespread heavy rainfall in several northern regions in China. Due to the impact of extreme weather and torrential rains, numerous tourist attractions in the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei region, including the Forbidden City, the Tiananmen Square, and the Universal Studios, have been closed. The Beijing municipal government has urged citizens to stay indoors unless necessary. Meteorological experts have stated that this round of heavy rainfall has affected around 130 million people. Here's a clip of the flood in Beijing. As of this moment, there are at least 11 people dead and 27 people missing. Besides businesses on the streets, bookstores and publishers suffered tremendously as most of the warehouses are located around Beijing in the most severely damaged areas. Books China, which is the largest online bookstore in the country, suffered from a loss of 80% of the inventory, which is about 4 million books. It is the darkest moment ever since we entered this industry, Books China stated. Here's a clip of what it looks like inside a warehouse, or what used to be a warehouse. Next up, let's turn to Chinese sports. On July 28th, the FINA World Championships in Fukuoka, Chinese swimmer Yi Wen made history by breaking the men's 200 meters breaststroke world record and winning the gold with a remarkable time of 2 minutes and 5.48 seconds. He becomes the first athlete ever to sweep all the gold medals in the men's 50, 100 and 200 meters breaststroke events at a single edition of the World Championships. As the 2023 Fukuoka FINA World Championships came to a close, Team China emerged as the dominant force with an impressive haul of 20 gold, 8 silver, and 12 bronze medals, topping the gold medal tally. The swimming team's remarkable performance marked a historic milestone for the Chinese swimming team at the World Championships, surpassing their previous best result achieved back in 1994 in Rome. On August 2nd, Qin won the gold medal in men's 100 meters breaststroke at the 31st Summer Universiade in Chengdu. Undoubtedly, he has become the most anticipated stars in Chinese swimming team, drawing significant attention and support from fans at home. While the swimming team are claiming medals in competitions, Chinese football is in the middle of another anti-corruption campaign. On August 2nd, former head coach of the Chinese men's national football team Li Tie is reportedly being prosecuted on 5 counts of bribery, including taking bribes, giving bribes, institutional bribery, taking bribes as a non-state employee, and bribing non-state employees. Li, born in 1977, is a prominent figure in Chinese football. By the age of 20, he was representing China in the World Cup qualifiers, and by 25, he participated in the 2002 FIFA World Cup in South Korea and Japan, later joining English Premier League club Everton. After retiring, he worked as Marcelo Lippi's assistant coach in Guangzhou and took over as the head coach of the Chinese men's national football team in January 2020. However, Li was sacked in 2021 due to the poor results. Throughout his career, he took on roles as player, coach, executive, endorser, and entrepreneur. Building a sprawling business empire, he owned 9 associated companies before the incident. His prosecution comes 6 months after an investigation began for suspected violations. It has triggered new anti-corruption storm in Chinese football, taking down over 10 figures, including Li's superiors at the time he was coach. The wide range of alleged crimes highlights the far reach of Li's case. It serves another warning that abuse of power will not be tolerated as China continues reforming football governance. Speaking of football, Chinese women's football team has just wrapped up the World Cup trip with the worst performance in history. With a disastrous 1-6 defeat to England, the Chinese women's football team was out of the World Cup. The Chinese team ended the group stage with 1 win and 2 losses, setting the worst record in its history in the tournament. Previously, China has never been eliminated in a group stage. Their best performance were in 1999, which they finished the tournament with a silver medal. The Chinese women's football team is seen as a source of Chinese pride, but in general, women's football has not received as much attention as men's football. Most people only pay attention to women's football at times of tournaments. Next up, a piece of news in the internationalization of RMB. In an unprecedented move, the Argentine government has announced its decision to utilize the Chinese currency RMB for its debt payment to the International Monetary Fund. Argentine Economy Minister Sergio Massa said in a speech on Monday that Argentina will repay a total of $2.7 billion in debt to the IMF, on which $1 billion is loaned by the Development Bank of Latin America, and other $1.7 billion will be repaid in yuan under the China-Argentina currency swap agreement. Massa also noted the agreement would allow Argentina to meet its IMF obligations without using a single dollar of its reserves. The deal represents another step in Argentina's efforts on reducing its reliance on the US dollar. In June, the Central Bank of Argentina allowed the Chinese currency for deposit taking in savings and current accounts, as Argentina aims to diversify its payment methods. Earlier this year, Argentina announced that it will pay for its Chinese imports in RMB yuan rather than US dollars. These decisions also underscore the growing economic ties between Argentina and China, with China emerging as one of Argentina's primary trading partners. Next up, on July 31st, 4 Chinese government and military departments issued a notice to exert temporary export controls on certain drones. The notice sets a limit on high-performance drones, including the ones with high payload and flight time that could be used for military purposes. In a press conference, the spokesperson from the Ministry of Commerce said export control is consistent with international standards without targeting any specific country or region. The notice was issued in the context of the extensive use of drones in armed conflicts around the world, especially the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Drones, especially high-quality, made-in-China civilian-level drones like DJI, are frequently used in military conflicts around the world. Despite DJI's efforts in banning the use of drones in conflicting areas like Ukraine and Russia, DJI's high reliability still attracts local militaries to smuggle drones into the areas. Many Chinese netizens connect this to the frequent drone attacks in Moscow in recent weeks. In online discussions, people joke that new regulations specifically target the former Soviet states. The extensive use of Soviet RPG-26 grenade weighs 3 kg, which just exceeds the maximum payload of exportable drones. Next up, let's take a look at the top trending songs in China. Recently, Chinese pop singer Dao Lang had made headlines on Chinese social media with his new album, Mountain Song Rally. and more particularly with his new song 罗刹海市. Daolang was once extremely popular in China back in the early 2000s. However, he has become semi-retired since 2013 as he felt the Chinese entertainment industry was corrupted. The song 罗刹海市 is based on a story from the Strange Tales from Liao Zhai, an ancient Chinese novel. The novel is a collection of supernatural stories written by Pu Songlin in the Qing dynasty. This particular song depicts a story in which the protagonist Ma Ji, a very handsome man, came across a city where people had completely different beauty standards. In the eyes of the locals, Ma Ji is a monster. To conform to the city, Ma Ji made himself appear ugly and soon became very successful. Some suggest the song is a retaliation towards rival pop stars who had criticized his work for being too down-to-earth and not cool enough. The song 罗刹海市 went so viral it was rumored to have broken the Guinness World Record with 8 billion hits, which was later debunked by the organization. Lastly, let's take a look at McDonald's. Milkshake is standard for McDonald's in the States. Yet in China, shakes are out of the menu since the 2000s. On August 2nd, in response to netizens' petition to bring back the milkshake, McDonald's China CEO Zhang Jiayin explained that McDonald's stopped selling milkshakes in mainland China because it didn't sell well. Many people didn't like the thick texture and preferred smoother drinks like Coke. Currently, milkshakes have been discontinued in almost all Asian countries. In response to online calls for the return of the milkshake, Zhang Jiayin said it may just be a nostalgia of childhood. Milkshakes are not the only cultural difference in McDonald's menu. Many popular dishes in its Chinese restaurants are proven to be failures in the North American market. Spicy chicken wings, for instance, are extremely popular in China but were ranked among the biggest failures in the States. Similarly, Chinese found it hard to accept buffalo wings and turkeys. Therefore, to some degree, all multinational food chains are fusions in one way or another. Hail to orange chicken, pineapple pizza, and Shanghai schnitzel. That's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts and comments about our show, please reach us at the email address below. I'm Chris. Looking forward to hearing from you and see you next time.
Hi, today we're very happy to have Mr. Peter Walk to join us to have a conversation and dialogue about a lot of issues. And so now let me give Peter the chance to introduce himself about his work experience and his background.
Let me just start with my interest in China, which has been pretty high for probably 40 years. So I studied biographies of a lot of my favorite people, so composers, authors, etc. So I got to develop a better understanding of the East versus the West. I think Western philosophies and religions are what I would call dualistic by nature. So they're inherently judgmental. So you have good, bad, heaven, hell, etc.
Is that mostly influenced by this Christianity?
Yes, very influenced by Jewish and Christian faith. And I just didn't find that very appealing. I don't like the idea that people are constantly looking for winners and losers. So when I studied the Eastern religions, and I started with Buddhism and Hinduism, I like very much the idea of harmony and balance. So I just said, I'm just basically an Easterner in a Western body. When I hit 60, I told my assistant I wanted to go to China every 6 to 8 weeks for a week.
So when was that? Which year?
That started probably 15 years ago. But I made over 80 trips to China because my field at McKinsey was insurance. So I was advising large insurance companies around the world.
So around the early 2000. So that was your first trip to China?
Yeah, first trips. And, well, I did some earlier trips when China was all bicycles, no cars.
Oh, in the 80s?
Yes, in the 80s and early 90s. But this was the first time I really spent dedicated time in China. And I wound up writing a book because I got so tired of reading in the Western press about the oppressive, corrupt government and the unhappy, oppressed people. And I said to myself, I've made over 80 trips. How come I've never met any of these unhappy, oppressed people?
But you travel to both the cities and the rural areas?
Yeah, but I'd say probably 75% would have been big cities.
Big cities,
Most of the other time I was here for pleasure with my family, with my
Okay.
kids, and
Okay.
yeah. So, but I developed a pretty good feel for China overall. So I wrote a book that largely examines the real differences between the U.S. and China, because the U.S. is always saying our model is the only right model, that ultimately everyone is going to become a democracy. By the way, I don't believe that at all.
Yep.
So the U.S. is an individualistic model, going back to escaping Europe. China is very much a collective model. U.S. has a relatively, they don't like to hear these words, a relatively weak government by design. So when the founding fathers developed the Constitution in the U.S., they basically said, let's do everything we can to minimize what the government is allowed to do, because should be a country of, by, and for the people.
Okay.
And China, on the other hand, had a very strong central government, has going back thousands of years. It's always had that. In part, I think, because people need to come together to protect against the invasions from the north. And then also the number of catastrophes, weather catastrophes, that required people to come together to kind of rebuild. So the model was very much...
So the U.S. seems to have a natural national border, so it's much safer compared
Yes,
to
totally.
China
Totally.
surrounding
Yeah, we had
nations.
no equivalents. I mean, when settlers arrived in in the U.S., the country was basically owned by Indians who were relatively unsophisticated, and the U.S. in a not very nice way basically
But it seems
forced them out.
the U.S. president, in the time of emergency, for example, perhaps also has a lot of power.
Yes,
And the Congress can also, set up new laws to overrule,
Yes.
the old ones,
Right.
in a time of emergency, maybe. So
Yeah.
that makes the U.S. quite flexible in
Yes.
dealing with crisis, and also during peaceful time, maybe
Yeah.
government try to minimize the
Yeah.
size.
yeah. But there is one very significant difference is the best and the brightest young people in the U.S. almost always go into business.
Go to business.
They do not go
also,
into government.
go
They
to-
view
go
as
to
the
law
government.
and
Yes.
medical field,
Yeah,
because that's where you make make a lot of money.
make a lot of money.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the best and the brightest, going back to the Mandarin tradition in China, generally went into public service and government.
Right. Yes.
But the net effect is, if I think about the people I've met in the Chinese government, they are highly educated. They tend to be pretty worldly and have had jobs in different sectors.
But how would you compare this kind of U.S. system with European countries? Because the whole process we call so-called modern civilization, whether that be scientific revolution or industrial revolution, they actually started in Europe. But how the European countries' political system differ from the U.S.
Yeah.
or they're similar?
They're similar in the sense that they're both democracies. So you rely on votes to select your leaders.
But their democracy come much later, right? Starting in the 18th century, 19th century, none of the European country was a democrat.
Yeah.
Had a democracy.
Yeah.
Right? It was under monarchy mostly.
Yeah, and you also had, Europe was a very deeply ingrained class system, whereas the U.S. from the very beginning was not a class system. I mean,
Right.
the purpose was equal opportunity for everyone because they were escaping Europe,
Right.
which was a class system.
Right.
But I think the economies evolved in fairly similar ways. I think the difference in the U.S. is the U.S. relied very much on immigration for creativity. So a lot of the great inventions, discoveries that came out of America really can be traced back to Europeans
Okay.
who emigrated to the United States,
Okay.
frequently because they wanted to escape oppression.
Okay.
in
Seems
Europe.
from the Chinese point of view, when I talk to lots of Chinese, whether they're from different background, when they talk about the U.S., it seems they have a much bigger picture in their mind. Is they talk about the West, and they know that the rise of the West started in Europe. So therefore, they like to compare what's the major difference between Europe and China. Then starting from there, they move to what's the major difference between U.S. and China.
Yeah.
So therefore, I would like to know from your point of view, if you compare Europe with China, and compare Europe with the U.S., what kind of major difference in terms of whether that be political system or institutions or some other background you see? The contrast between U.S. and China seems much striking larger.
Yes.
But if you compare Europe and China, especially in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century when Europe rose up, maybe the difference was different, or different type of difference. How would you see that?
Well, I mean, obviously, there wasn't that much interaction between the Europeans and China until the Opium Wars in the 19th century.
Right.
And I think, especially Great Britain, which kind of took the lead, I think that created a pretty high level of tension between China and the Europeans.
Right.
I think the Americans played a role in the Opium Wars, but it wasn't a dramatic role.
Right.
And I think I'd say the Europeans in general were more aggressive.
Also, they seems their government had more centralized power.
Yeah.
To facilitate industrialization, right?
Yeah.
That's why First World War, Second World War took place among those European countries.
Well, I think, I mean, to me, the main thing that happened in the 19th century is that China missed the Industrial Revolution.
That's a very interesting point.
So you had the Qing dynasty run by the Manchus, where frankly you have examples like Empress Xixi, who spent the treasury on rebuilding the summer palace as opposed to the navy, which is what it was meant for.
Yeah.
So I think the inward focus of the Manchus under the Qing dynasty led to a lack of interest in what was going on in the rest of the world, and not any real intellectual curiosity. So when you had the Brits show up for the first time with, here are all of our discoveries, and here's what's enabling us to modernize, the response from the empress or emperor at the time was very much, we have nothing to learn from the West.
I think that time China really was not aware or know very little about what's going on in Europe.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you think they might have behaved differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So if you think about Chinese history, if you missed the Industrial Revolution, which was really affecting most of the advanced Western countries, and the US and the UK probably played a prominent role.
Maybe that's also why historians often talk about, Germany used to be a backward area or nation, was not even unified, and until maybe late second half of 19th century, then Germany started to emerge as a power.
Yes.
So how could Germany do that, whereas other European nations like Poland, I don't know, failed to achieve that?
Yeah.
And also in Asia, Japan, came into place, and but people also talk about how come Japan succeeded in capturing the process of industrialization, whereas China keep falling behind.
If you take those two examples, I mean, what was the common denominator is both Germany and Japan were very anxious to build up their industrial might for military reasons. So Japan was very aggressive militarily vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia, and other areas. So I think once you start down that track, then you want to be able to build ships, you want to be able to build an army, you want to be able to build everything that goes with military might. And Germany, exactly the same.
Actually,
Germany was obviously a very major player in European wars in the late 19th century, and then very aggressive and active in World War I and World War II. So I think a lot, in those two cases, the industrialization followed a military spin.
War created capitalism. So capitalism arose in Europe, not in Asia, because they had a constant state of wars. And those war created demand for different type of organization, different type of financing, and obviously created a need to encourage commerce, because that gives you the money to finance wars. And therefore, so-called militaristic state way of industrialization actually came much earlier, like starting from Renaissance. Those Italian city-state, like Venice, they were essentially militaristic state. On one hand, they need commerce. On one other hand, they need a strong army, military. So later on, as a later comer, like Germany and Japan, they need to do more Otherwise, they would not be able to squeeze in to become a power.
Yeah.
So all the European powers, like in France, Louis XIV and Napoleon, and so all the European powers had this feature of militaristic industrialization. So maybe that's another explanation for China's failure. They never thought of or wanted to go that road. I think Qing Dynasty perhaps has another reason, because they are, like you mentioned, the minority to control the major Han people. Even like a city-state like Venice, if they want to rise up, they need essentially everyone to be able to fight and everyone to be able to do business.
Yeah.
But if Qing Dynasty government, the Chinese government do that, that means all the financial resources and the military power will shift to the Han people. That will create a threat. So maybe that's an additional reason they didn't take that route.
Yeah.
Whereas for Japan, once they have the emperor, who is the god of everyone, that seems that problem at least can be solved. I don't know. So that's one perspective.
Yeah.
Of course, the U.S. then become very different now, because the U.S. did not rely on monarch. They did not have any more kings, queens. But the U.S. later on also, like today, you look at the U.S. this military complex, industrial complex, is something analogous to that kind of tradition.
Yes.
Very strong in that.
Yeah.
So people, developing countries, think that this seems to be one of the essential elements for any country to become industrialized. You need that to create the huge incentive and demand for heavy industries,
Yes.
for lots of other things, and for technology adoption, and otherwise you will be defeated,
Yeah.
be killed. So that's one view. And of course, the U.S. has a lot of different features, like they minimize the size of government, but that's impossible for European. If you do that, perhaps you will be the next one to be destroyed.
Yeah.
How do you think this kind of perspective? This is essentially the view of Braudel and Sombat. They think war created capitalism. So people say, why capitalism never arises in East, in Asia? This provides one explanation. Of course, according to Max Weber, he had a different view. His religion is different. Christian people, they are more industrious. They like to save. But that view seems not very consistent with history, because the Jewish people also, very industrious, very like to save. Chinese or the Buddhist people, perhaps they may be also good at doing, I don't know, those kind of things. But they were not able to rise. Maybe because of the lack of centralized militaristic industrialization motive, what you call like a national will, to use that will to mobilize resources, to organize the nation in a different way to compete with the European nations.
Yeah.
But the U.S. was able to do that, maybe not in the very beginning, but the U.S. know that, right? They know the European, how they behave. So the U.S. later on also built a military, also through the Civil War, that further enhanced the U.S. military capacity. So that could play a role. So China, when China became sort of kind of have a mindset where we do need a national army to be militarized, was during the Civil War and the war against Japan. So that helped the Chinese finally to be organized militarily to fight. And with that military fighting capacity, then you enter the social planning era. But the social planning era, although you have a strong military kind of mindset, but you did not allow market to flourish. So you miss one part. And Deng Xiaoping solved that. He not only inherited this kind of military institutional capacity, but also allowed market. Whereas the Qing Dynasty had maybe just market, but no this kind of lack of this.
I think there's two fundamental differences between the U.S. and Europe. Europeans have always been a very highly fragmented continent.
Right.
So you've got language differences, you have cultural differences, you have religious differences, and you also have the fact that war in the 19th century was almost a constant state. I mean, right up through World War I and then kicking in World War II. So I think that fragmentation, and even though they tried to solve it to some extent by creating the EU, there are still fairly significant differences among the major countries. It was a huge advantage for the US and China to basically have a large single language integrated country. And the US had the added advantage of, while it was involved in wars, it was never on their own land. So one of the reasons I think for the economic success of the US is they were able to avoid war other than selectively joining, as they did obviously in World War I and World War II. And then China, the same thing. I mean, China, the challenge for many years was the internal fighting of the warlords and the Civil War. But once under Deng, China became very focused on market-driven economy and consumerism. Deng just did an extraordinary job in a short period of time.
So this is interesting. So, East European countries also conducted market reform, and their economic foundation was much more superior. They had a social plan era, but they built lots of industries, including military industries. How come after introducing market reform, they could not perform as well as China? So you mentioned about Deng Xiaoping. So what's the major difference between Deng Xiaoping's leadership versus the leadership in East European countries? Where did they go wrong in a sense? They had a much better foundation to the market reform. They did not go through cultural revolution. So what's your view on this?
Yeah, I think a huge advantage China has always had is just scale.
Okay.
So when you've got a consumer population today of 1.4 billion, even when you look at the Asian tigers, so when you looked at Hong Kong and Singapore and Taiwan and Korea, they have not been able to create anywhere near the economic footprint that China has created, in part because of the scale of the country, the population in China.
Yes, okay, so economy of scale is very important. That may also explain the US success compared to European countries. US had much larger scale, right? So even though German engineers, they may be very good, the Japanese may be very good, but your scale of the economy is very limited, right? So on the other hand, there's also maybe some advantage for smaller countries. For example, you need to develop an economy, you need a mass production, and you need a global market. But the size of Singapore, because perhaps they only need a tiny bit of a global market that can support their industrialization. Whereas China needs the entire Earth, and the Earth is very limited. So that may also make smaller countries somehow easier on their way of industrialization in terms of creating global market. I heard that during Singapore's industrialization process in the 60s, 50s, 70s, they had a huge sector of manufacturing wax. But that market alone is able to support lots of people's employment. For China, you cannot just rely on that. You need to rely on perhaps other much larger markets such as textile. But the textile market globally is very limited. The US give China some quota, and so that's it. I heard from Taiwanese economists, they say US give them a quota, and soon the quota was filled. Then they have to search for alternative market. They say fortunately China opened their door for reform, so China became Taiwan's largest possible global market to absorb their industrial output. So then you look from that point of view, it's harder for China. Where's the global market? Now the US is also trying to shrink China's global market. So that will make, you think that will make China's industrialization process harder to finish?
Well, harder. First of all, I think the idea of containing China is a ridiculous idea. Because if you look at the economic momentum of China, if you look at the cultural advantages, Chinese people just work harder than Americans. And there's no denying that.
That's also the same view from the Europeans. They say Americans work much harder than the Europeans.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, look at European, the number of strikes and the number of holidays. I mean, when we McKinsey hire people from in North America, from France and from Spain, I mean, they just are used to a model that is far less demanding. Whereas China is again, dramatically harder worker. So having worked at McKinsey and worked in many of our U.S.
Okay.
offices, and then the same in China. It's very different.
How different?
Well, first of all, if you were to go to most Americans and say, you're going to work 6 days a week, not 5, you're going to work from 9 to 9, they'd say you're crazy.
Okay.
I mean,
but that's just
it would not be accepted
That's
socially.
a reason in the U.S., right? But you go back to 19th century, perhaps the average Americans work as hard as Chinese. They work for 6 days, even 7 days per day, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe during times of challenge, like war times. But I think, if I think about my father who grew up in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, his hours were not dissimilar from people working in the U.S. today.
Okay.
When I would work with the Beijing or Shanghai office at McKinsey, you would just, if you watch, you would see the lights on very late at night, and then you'd see people falling asleep at their desks during the day because they basically got no sleep.
Maybe there's a pattern. Later comer, you have to work harder than the earlier ones.
Yeah.
So U.S. people, American people work harder than Europeans. And Chinese people have to work harder than the U.S. in order to come up. Otherwise, it's impossible. So just like the Germany and the Japan, they need to be far more militaristic state. Otherwise, there's no chance for them to rise up. Because the stage was already fully occupied. Like in academia, in the U.S., it's so normal for all the professors stay in their office until 8, 9, sometimes even midnight. But I travel to Europe. It's impossible. If you do that, other people will look down at you. Why do you need to work so hard?
Sure.
So around 5 or 4, everybody just knock on other people's door saying, let's go home.
Yeah.
Precisely, U.S. is a latecomer in terms of industrialization. Maybe that explains why the U.S. behave differently.
Yeah.
Otherwise, but China compared to the U.S. is much even later comer. That's maybe one way to explain. But in the future, once China become rich, you will see Indian people work much harder, and the Chinese start to relax, and they want to get off around 4, and they only want to work for 3 or 5 days a week.
Yeah. I would say the Chinese work much smarter than the Indians do. So I'll give you an example.
Now,
I was visiting Delhi. My family and I were going to go to Rajasthan in the north. We were on this beautiful 6-lane highway coming out of Delhi.
6-lane highway.
That's
very good.
Well, 3 each way.
Okay.
But it turned into a dirt road after about 50 miles.
Oh, okay, all right.
I said, well, what happened? Oh, the new mayor doesn't support Rajasthan and doesn't respect what they do. So he just stopped the road.
Okay.
So the amount of what I would call economic irrationality in India is huge.
This is huge.
So even though the people are very smart and they turn out more high-end students, which we saw at McKinsey than almost any other country, you do not have anything like the system in China where you've got large numbers of highly educated people advanced meritocratically in the party, and they're all on the same page. I mean, getting all Indians, just start with the Muslims and the Hindus, they are not a united country.
Right.
I think the U.S. for 150 years has been the top economy in the world. I think one reason you see very little intellectual curiosity in the U.S. about what other countries are doing is because they've been so used to the idea that we're number one. One reason they push back against China's success is because it's a dualistic mindset with winners and losers. So Americans genuinely believe that if China is very successful, they win and we lose. And you'd explain that to Chinese people and they say, why do you look at it that? Why don't you just say, don't we want both sides to win? If you just think about in our government and listening to government people talk about China, they know nothing about China.
Really? They know nothing?
And I talked.
Seems the Biden administration and even the Trump administration, they have lots of people. Seems they know China very well, so that they can design good policy to contain China.
Let's just say they're very confident. I would say grossly overconfident in what they know about China. I think if you ask them, tell me about Confucianism, they say, oh, we know all about that. The Confucian Institutes were put in the U.S. to spy. When you say, no, I'm talking about the Confucian values, you wouldn't find more than 5% of Americans who could explain anything about Confucianism. I was at Peking University, and they said, Pete, we had a delegation of 16 Congress people, all very focused on China in a negative way. Of the 16, one had been to China 3 times, one had been to China once, 14 had never been to China.
Who are they?
I don't know.
Okay. Just about
But still,
right.
it's a very small number.
Right.
And when you listen to congressmen who generally are very aggressive about China and always explaining China and the way it works, so they'll frequently say, well, it's inevitable that China will become a democracy because the Chinese people are so unhappy. And you say, well, what evidence do you actually? They don't have any evidence because they've never been. And how do you explain
but maybe, on the other hand, maybe natural, because I believe those congressmen, most of them have gone to Europe or even to Japan. But China just recently become developed. So therefore, they have not had the chance. Who want to go to a backward, underdeveloped country, right? So the incentive was not there. You go to more developed or equal. When China just recently suddenly emerged, maybe they did not have the chance yet.
I mean, I just see it as a level of overconfidence based on 150 years of being number one.
150 years, okay, yes.
And yeah, I mean, it goes back to literally the late 1800s when the Industrial Revolution really gained steam. And the U.S. talks about the theft of intellectual property, like this is a unique thing. During the 19th century, the U.S. had a huge department in Washington whose only job was to steal intellectual property from the Brits.
Yes.
So this has been going on for years.
Yeah. And actually the same, Brits, they, when during their time, rise up, they spend a lot of energy stealing technology from Italy.
Yeah.
And Italy stole technology from Arabs.
Yeah.
So this
has been going on forever.
Forever, that's right.
Yeah.
But later on, U.S. become an innovator. So and since then they start to think, we have always been an innovator and we're number one. That's true.
But I mean, China is innovative, but in a different way. China is much more application driven. So when the iPhone comes out, things like the iPhone and the internet and what I would call the big economic ideas, they tend to come from America. But if you look at the actual development of applications, so if you take the iPhone and look at all the businesses in China that have been built around the iPhone, it's pretty impressive and huge.
But it seems the same actually for the U.S. as you mentioned. In the 19th century, U.S. was a student of Europe.
Yes.
And all the technology they learned, they copied, even they stole. But through that process, later on, you become on the top.
Yeah.
Maybe China was still in the stage of like early U.S.
Yeah.
Mostly rely on learning and mimicking.
Yep.
But later on, China will become an innovator on the top because you already start to see signs anywhere, right? Maybe that's a natural process for India someday maybe the same. India maybe nowadays or perhaps the next decades is still a very good student of learning, copying, and but eventually they may become on the top, become a innovator in the frontier. I remember that in the 19th century U.S., if you search for encyclopedia, you search for a famous American scientist doing pure science, you find none, zero. But the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, U.S. was already become a top in terms of industrialization, in terms of commerce, in terms of application. But zero in pure scientific research. But once entered the 20th century, then U.S. become on the top. And in the early stage, U.S. will actually rely on immigrants from Europe because they have the two wars. Yeah. But later on, U.S. start to have its own very famous and very innovative scientists, more and Americans. Then later on, you no longer see European names. Maybe that's just a natural process. So nowadays, you still see China as very good at learning, mimicking, but you never know. I don't know. Maybe 20 years down the road, China may also start to have very innovative, not just the technology, but also in terms of basic research.
Yeah.
The government is now pumping money into
Yeah.
universities, and universities are reforming their way of educating people. So this is maybe a natural pattern.
Yeah.
But it may not always be successful because many countries eventually could not move to the frontier.
Yeah, but in many ways, China's already there. I mean, if you look at Huawei, Huawei was the global leader in technology and telecom with 5G, and that was pretty impressive. And if you look at what China has done in EVs,
Right.
and what they did in high-speed rail, so there are a lot of areas where China has, I think, leapfrogged the rest of the world.
Do you think
already.
that the U.S. policy now is actually pushing or encouraging Chinese to become an innovator in chip industry?
absolutely.
Otherwise, why would they have the incentive? It's much cheaper to buy U.S. chips at high quality, low price.
Yeah.
You do on your own, it's very costly. And
Yeah.
now you said, you do on your own, we won't sell to you. Well, that
Yeah.
may actually
Well,
push China to there.
The reason you do want to become reasonably independent is you can't count on globalization. I personally think that the Contain China movement, history will look back on that as a very foolish idea. Because what you're doing is you're really encouraging China to double down on its investment
Precisely.
in the areas where U.S. has a strength. And if you push the ultimate globalization or economic development, you're going to find that the Chinese, once they get truly independent of the U.S., they have long memories. They're not going to go back to the U.S. and say, well, okay, now let's be friends. They're going to say, you weren't there for us, and now we've matched you. We're going to go our own way,
Actually,
which would be a lose.
And this was another episode of China Now, a show that opens a window to the present and future of the Asian giant. Hope you enjoy it. See you the next time.